The coronation spire stood at the center of Ithara Prime like a needle stitching the ground to the sky. It was older than most civilizations in the galaxy. Its walls were carved from pale stone that no one could name, and its halls stretched so wide that entire fleets could have parked inside. But the spire was not built for ships. It was built for one thing only: the sovereign's crucible. The crucible was a black obelisk, smooth as water and tall as 3 men. It sat on a raised platform at the heart of the great hall, surrounded by rings of tiered seating that climbed toward the domed ceiling. No one knew who built it. No one knew what it was made of. What everyone knew was what it did. Every 60 cycles, the noble houses of the Galactic Concord sent their heirs to stand before the crucible. The machine would read them, their minds, their blood, their spirit, and it would speak a title. That title defined their right to rule. In 4,000 years, the crucible had never refused an heir from a recognized noble house. Not once. The test had become a ceremony, a formality, a tradition wrapped in old ritual. The heirs arrived in jeweled ships, walked the ancient carpet to the dais, and received their names. It was as predictable as sunrise. Today, 15 heirs had come. The great hall was full. Diplomats, generals, scholars, and spies filled every seat. Floating camera drones from 100 different worlds buzzed near the ceiling like metal insects, broadcasting the event to trillions. The air smelled of incense and old power. The first heir stepped forward. Prince Vishan of the Elori Dominion was tall, nearly 8 feet, and his body was made of living crystal that shifted between blue and white with every step. The Elori were the oldest house in the Concord, and they treated the crucible with something close to worship. Vishan knelt before the obelisk and placed both hands on its surface. The crucible hummed. Light pulsed through its body in slow, steady waves. Then it spoke, and its voice filled the hall like rolling thunder. The luminous shield. The crowd applauded. Vishan rose, bowed to the crucible, and walked to his seat with quiet dignity. It was exactly what everyone expected. Next came Matriarch-elect Surya of the Kel Supremacy. She was insectoid, 4 arms, black chitin armor that grew from her own body, and compound eyes that reflected the light in 1,000 tiny mirrors. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had already calculated every outcome in the room. She touched the crucible with 2 of her 4 hands. The Iron Mandate. Surya clicked her mandibles in satisfaction and returned to her seat without looking at anyone. Then Duke Toranes of the Velhari Ascendancy. He was reptilian, broad as a wall, with green-black scales and a jaw that could crack stone. The Velhari were warriors, and Toranes looked every bit the part. He slammed his fist against the crucible like he was daring it to refuse him. The Storm General. Toranes let out a roar that shook the nearest camera drones. His delegation stomped their feet in approval. One by one, the heirs came. A pale, floating Nethari who received the name the Whispered Oracle, a massive, stone-bodied Gorath who was called the Mountain's Will. 12 more after that, each one named, each one approved. The ceremony moved like clockwork. The crowd grew comfortable. Some of the diplomats were already checking their messages. Then the 15th name was called. Evan Mercer, representative of Earth's United Territories. A silence spread through the hall, not a respectful silence, not a ceremonial pause. It was the silence of confusion. A few of the diplomats looked at each other. Someone in the Velhari section laughed quietly. Evan Mercer was human. He was average height, average build, with short brown hair and a face that looked like it had seen more bad food than battlefield glory. He wore a borrowed formal jacket that did not fit well across the shoulders. He walked to the dais the way a man walks into a room where he knows he does not belong, carefully, with his hands slightly open at his sides, ready for something to go wrong. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord only 12 years ago. They had won a minor border war against a species that no one important cared about, and the legal aftermath had given Earth a single seat among the noble houses. It was a technicality, a footnote. No one considered humans to be true nobility. They had no ancient bloodline, no dynasty, no tradition. Evan was not even an heir. He was a former soldier who had been working as a diplomatic assistant on a space station when his name was pulled from a short list of people who were available and willing. He was sent because no one else wanted to go. He stepped onto the dais. The crucible activated. Its surface began to glow the way it always did, a deep pulse of light rising from within. The hall waited. 5 seconds. 10. The light inside the obelisk flickered. Then it stopped. The hum died. The light went out. The crucible stood silent, completely, absolutely silent. Evan looked at the obelisk, then looked at the crowd. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to ask if he had done it wrong, but before he could speak, a crack appeared on the surface of the crucible. Then another. Then a dozen more, spreading like a web of lightning frozen in stone. In 4,000 years, the crucible had never cracked, not once. The crowd was on its feet. Voices rose. Toranes was shouting something. Surya had gone very still. Vishan was staring at the crucible with an expression that might have been fear or might have been awe. Then the crucible spoke. But it did not speak the way it had spoken before. The voice that came from it was deeper, older, and it shook the floor beneath every seat in the hall. The camera drones trembled in the air. The incense smoke scattered. It said 2 words. Crownless King. Then the light inside the obelisk died completely. The hum faded to nothing. The crucible went dark, truly dark, for the first time in recorded history. The hall erupted. Evan Mercer stood alone on the dais. A man with no crown, no title he understood, and no idea what had just happened. Around him, every diplomat, spy, general, and noble heir in the galaxy was staring at him with expressions that ranged from shock to fury to something that looked very much like terror. He had come here as a placeholder, a nobody filling a seat that no one cared about. Now every eye in the galaxy was on him, and the oldest machine in the known universe had just called him something that should not exist. Somewhere in the back of the hall, an archivist dropped a datapad and whispered to no one in particular. That word king, it outranks them all. And Evan Mercer, former soldier, former assistant, former nobody, stood in the silence that followed and thought one very human thought. What have I gotten myself into? The hours after the ceremony were chaos, wrapped in whispers. Evan was escorted from the great hall by 4 guards who said nothing, and took him to a guest chamber deep inside the spire. The room was large and clean and cold, with walls made of the same pale stone as the rest of the building. There was a bed, a table, and a window that looked out onto the endless gray plains of Ithara Prime. The door locked behind him from the outside. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands. They were shaking. Outside his room, the Galactic Concord was falling apart. The Council of Noble Houses gathered in an emergency session within the hour. The chamber was round, with seats arranged in a rising circle so that every house could see every other house. Normally, council sessions were slow, formal, full of careful language and ancient protocol. This one was a shouting match before the first speaker finished a sentence. Duke Toranes was on his feet immediately. His voice filled the chamber like a rock slide. "The crucible is broken," he said. "That is the only explanation. A human, a species that has been part of this Concord for barely a decade, cannot be given a classification that outranks houses that have served for millennia. I demand the result be struck from the record." Matriarch-elect Surya sat with all 4 arms folded across her chest, her compound eyes watching everything at once. She did not shout. She never shouted. "Broken or not," she said calmly, "the crucible has never been wrong before. If we discard this result, we set a precedent. Any house that receives a title it dislikes can simply claim the machine was faulty. That destroys the entire system." "Then what do you suggest?" Toranes snapped. That we bow to a human soldier who was chosen because no one else wanted the job. I suggest we study the situation before we start breaking things, Surya replied, including you, Duke. Prince Vishan spoke last. His crystalline body cast blue light across the nearby seats, and his voice was soft but carried well. The Crucible is not a machine in the way we understand machines. It is something older and deeper. I have stood before it. We all have. We all felt what it does. It reaches inside you and finds the truth. If it called this human a crownless king, then that is what he is. We may not understand what it means, but we should not be so quick to call the Crucible a liar. Toranis turned to Vishan with open contempt. You would trust the judgment of a broken relic over 4,000 years of tradition. I would trust the Crucible over the pride of a man who is afraid of what it said. The chamber went quiet. Toranis sat down slowly, his yellow eyes burning. While the council argued, the archivists of the Pale Record worked through the night. The archivists were the keepers of the Crucible's history, every title, every heir, every reading going back to the very first day the machine was activated. Their library filled an entire underground level of the spire, rows upon rows of crystal data tablets stacked in climate-controlled vaults. The chief archivist was an elderly Nethari named Salin, a wispy, translucent figure who floated through the library like a ghost made of pale silk. Salin had spent 200 years studying the Crucible and had never found anything that surprised her, until today. Her team searched for the phrase "crownless king" in every record they had. They found it only once, buried in the deepest layer of the Crucible's original programming, a layer so old that the language it used was barely translatable. It was not a title that had been given before. It was a warning, written by whoever had built the Crucible in an age so distant that no living species remembered it. The translation was incomplete. Large sections were corrupted or missing, but one passage came through clearly enough to make Salin stop and read it 3 times. When the crownless king stands before the throne of testing, the age of inherited power ends. What follows is either renewal or annihilation. Salin brought the finding to the council's closed session the next morning. The room went silent when she read it. Even Toranis had nothing to say for a long moment. Then he found his voice. All the more reason to remove the human. If this prophecy or warning or whatever it is speaks of the end of inherited power, then this man is a threat to every house in this chamber. Execute him. End this before it begins. Surya tilted her head. Or imprison him. Execution makes a martyr. A quiet cell makes a footnote. Vishan shook his head slowly. You are both afraid, and fear is a poor advisor. The council voted to delay any decision for 72 hours while more research was conducted. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. Back in his locked room, Evan Mercer had not slept. He had tried to contact Earth's diplomatic corps through the communication terminal in his quarters, but every channel was delayed, rerouted, or simply dead. Someone was blocking his signals. He did not know who, but he could guess there were several candidates. He paced the room. He looked out the window. He tried to eat the food that was brought to him, but it tasted like nothing. His mind kept returning to the moment on the dais, the way the Crucible's light had stopped, the way the cracks had appeared, and that voice. That deep, ancient voice that had called him something impossible. Crownless king. He was not a king. He had grown up in a colony town on Mars, the kind of place where the buildings were made of recycled shipping containers and the air always tasted faintly of metal. He had joined the military at 19 because it was the only job that offered 3 meals a day. He had fought in a border skirmish that lasted 6 weeks and killed people he never saw clearly. After that, he took a desk job with the diplomatic service because someone told him it was quieter. It was. Until now. On the second night, he fell asleep at the table with his head on his arms, and the Crucible, dormant and dark in the great hall above, reached into his mind. He dreamed. He saw the Elori Dominion, Vishan's people, their crystal cities cracking from within as younger generations abandoned tradition and older generations clung to it until everything shattered. He saw the Kel supremacy, Surya's people, their hive mind fracturing into factions, each one claiming to be the true heir to power. He saw the Velhari, Toranes' people, their military stretched across too many borders, their soldiers fighting wars that no longer had a purpose. He saw a dozen other civilizations doing the same thing in a dozen different ways, crumbling, rotting, dying from the inside. The noble houses were not strong. They were hollow. Every generation inherited power that the previous generation had earned, and every generation understood that power a little less. The Conquered was a beautiful building with no foundation, and it was already falling. The Crucible showed him all of this, not with words but with images and feelings that pressed into his mind like fingerprints on wet clay. And beneath it all, a single message, repeated like a heartbeat. You see it, they do not. That is why I chose you. Evan woke up gasping. The room was dark. The window showed a sky full of unfamiliar stars. He sat there for a long time, breathing slowly, and realized something that settled into his stomach like a cold stone. The Crucible was not broken. It was not malfunctioning. It was awake in a way it had not been for thousands of years, and it had looked across a hall full of princes and generals and matriarchs, and it had chosen the nobody from Mars. Not because he was special, but because he could see the truth that none of them were willing to look at. The age of inherited power was ending. The only question was whether anyone would survive the change. And somewhere in the spire, behind closed doors and encrypted channels, Duke Toranes was already making calls to the Velhari home system. If the Council would not act, then he would act alone. The human would not leave HFY Prime alive. The Council's compromise lasted exactly 71 hours. On the morning of the third day before the deadline expired, a new proposal was put forward, not by Toranes, not by Surya, but by a coalition of smaller houses who had spent the last 3 days in quiet, desperate negotiation. Their solution was old, older than the Crucible itself. The trials of legitimacy. The trials had not been invoked in over 2,000 years. They predated the Crucible, dating back to a time when disputes over rulership were settled not by machines, but by tests of character. There were 3 of them: command, wisdom, and sacrifice, and any candidate who passed all 3 was considered a true ruler by the oldest laws of the Conquered. Any candidate who failed was stripped of all claims. The terms were simple and brutal. If Evan failed even one trial, his classification would be erased, and humanity would lose its seat among the noble houses permanently. If he passed, the title of Crownless King would stand, and every house would have to deal with whatever that meant. Toranes agreed immediately. He was confident the human would be crushed. Surya agreed because she saw opportunity in every direction. Vishan agreed reluctantly, warning that testing the Crucible's chosen was dangerous. Evan was not given a choice. He was told what was happening and given 6 hours to prepare. He spent those 6 hours sitting in his room, staring at the wall, and trying to remember everything he had ever learned about not dying. The first trial was command. It took place in a massive orbital arena above HFY Prime, a ring-shaped station filled with real drone fleets, sensor arrays, and tactical command stations. Each candidate was given control of a simulated fleet and placed in a combat scenario against the others. The rules were straightforward: destroy or disable the opposing forces. Last fleet standing wins. Toranes moved first. His strategy was pure Velhari overwhelming force concentrated into a single hammer blow aimed at the weakest opponent. He smashed through 2 minor airs within minutes and turned his attention to Surya. Surya had already anticipated this. Her fleet had scattered into small, nearly invisible strike groups that hit supply lines and communication relays. She never fought head-on. She bled her enemies slowly while they searched for targets they could not find. Vishan commanded with precision and grace, forming defensive formations that adapted to every threat in real time. His fleet moved like a living thing, shifting and flowing around attacks like water around stone. Evan stared at his command screen and felt sick. He had never commanded a fleet. He had never even served on a ship larger than a troop transport. His military experience was 6 weeks of ground combat in a border dispute that most people had already forgotten. He looked at the forces available to him. A mid-sized fleet, nothing special. He looked at the combat zone. It included 3 simulated colony worlds with civilian populations. He made a decision that no one in the arena expected. He surrendered his entire fleet. Not to the enemy, to the civilians. He broke his warships into individual units and distributed them among the 3 colony worlds, arming the civilian populations and turning every city into a fortress. Then he broadcast a message on all channels: any fleet that enters civilian space will face resistance from the population itself. I am not fighting this war. I am making this war impossible to win. The judges did not know what to do. Torreny sent forces against one of the colony worlds and found that the armed civilians, supported by Evan's distributed units, fought with a ferocity that his organized military formations could not match. Every building was a trap. Every street was an ambush. His drones were destroyed faster than he could replace them. He pulled back, cursing. The trial ended with no clear military victor. Evan had not won the battle, but he had made the battle unwinnable for everyone else. The archivists in the observation gallery exchanged looks. One of them pulled up records of human military history and found a word that appeared again and again across centuries of Earth's wars: insurgency. The ability to fight without an army, to turn civilians into soldiers and cities into weapons, to make occupation so costly that even the strongest invader eventually left. It was not elegant. It was not noble. It terrified every military officer in the room. The second trial was wisdom. The candidates were brought to a sealed chamber and presented with a real diplomatic crisis. 2 species, the Dreneth and the Corvalli, shared a colony world called Tessara. Both had legitimate claims to the planet. Both had been there for generations. But the planet's resources were running out, and it could no longer support both populations. One had to leave. Every heir was given time to study the situation and propose a solution. Torreny's proposed giving the planet to the stronger species. The Dreneth have a larger military. They keep the world. The Corvalli relocate. That is the natural order. Surya proposed a trade arrangement. Give the Corvalli economic concessions on 3 other worlds in exchange for leaving Tessara. Make it profitable for them to go. Vishan proposed a joint governance council with rotating authority, though he admitted the hatred between the 2 species made this difficult. Evan asked for something unusual. He asked to speak to representatives of both species privately, outside the formal trial setting. The judges allowed it after some debate. He spent 2 hours with the Dreneth and 2 hours with the Corvalli. When he came back, he did not propose a solution for the current generation. He proposed one for the next. Both species hate each other, he said. That hate is real and it is earned, and I am not going to pretend it can be fixed with a treaty. But their children do not hate each other yet. My proposal is this: a shared constitution for Tessara, written not by the current leaders but by a council of young people from both species, people under the age of maturity who will actually have to live with the result. Rotating sovereignty every 10 cycles, governed by that constitution. The current generation will complain. They will fight it. But they will also grow old and die, and what they leave behind will be a framework that belongs to the people who come after. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Several of the judges looked at each other. The proposal was naive by galactic standards. It ignored power dynamics, military reality, and centuries of precedent. But it was also the only solution that did not require anyone to lose their home. the only one that treated the future as more important than the present. The judges scored it as inconclusive, but the archivists noted something in their records. It was the first time in the history of the trials that a candidate had asked to speak directly to the people affected by the crisis, rather than deciding their fate from above. The third trial was sacrifice. This was the oldest and simplest of the three. Each candidate stood before the assembly and offered something of personal value to prove their commitment to their people. The sacrifice had to be real, meaningful, and witnessed. Toranes offered 3 star systems from the Velhari border territories. Surya offered exclusive trade agreements worth billions. Vishan offered his personal fleet, a gesture that drew gasps from the Elori delegation. Other heirs offered land, wealth, military assets, political concessions. Each one gave away something significant, and each one still had plenty left afterward. Then Evan stood up. He had nothing. Humanity owned almost nothing in the Conquered. No great fleets, no wealthy colonies, no ancient treasures. He could not offer territory because Earth had barely enough. He could not offer money because humanity was still paying off the debts from the border war. He stood in silence for a moment that stretched too long. Then he spoke. I cannot offer what I do not have, so I offer myself. If my presence in this Conquered is a threat to its stability, I will accept permanent exile from all conquered space, including Earth. I will never see my home again. I will never speak to my family again. I will give up everything that makes my life mine so that my species keeps its seat at this table. That is all I have. That is what I offer. The hall went completely still. Toranes had offered star systems he would never visit. Surya had offered money she would never miss. Evan had offered the only thing he had his entire life. The trials ended with no clear winner. The judges deliberated for hours and returned a verdict that had never been given before. No candidate had decisively passed or failed. The result was a draw. But something had shifted in that hall. After the last trial ended, as the delegations filed out in murmuring groups, 7 minor house representatives quietly approached Evan in the corridor. They did not come with offers or threats. They came with a question that none of the great houses had thought to ask. What would you do, one of them said, if you actually had the power to change things? Evan looked at them for a long time. I would ask that question to everyone, he said, not just the people who were born with crowns. That night, while Evan slept and the Conquered debated, Duke Toranes sent an encrypted transmission to the Velhari home system. The message was short. It contained coordinates for Earth's solar system and a single order. Blockade full fleet immediately. If the Conquered would not remove the human, the Velhari would remove humanity from the equation entirely. The news arrived at Ithara Prime like a blade between the ribs. 47 Velhari warships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system and arranged themselves in a blockade formation across every major approach lane. They were not firing. They did not need to. 47 capital ships with full weapon arrays could turn every human colony from Mars to the outer stations into ash. Their presence alone was the message. Humanity existed at the Velhari's pleasure, and that pleasure had run out. Toranes announced the blockade to the Council as a security measure to protect the Conquered from instability. No one in the chamber believed him, but belief was not required. What mattered was that the Velhari fleet was the second largest in the galaxy, and no single house had the strength to force them to withdraw. Earth's defense force was small. 23 military vessels, most of them patrol ships and light cruisers designed for border duty. They could hold the line for days, maybe weeks, not months, and everyone in the Conquered knew it. The Council fractured immediately. Half the houses supported Toranes quietly. They had been looking for an excuse to push humanity out of the nobility since the beginning, and this was convenient. The other half were alarmed but paralyzed. Speaking against the Velhari meant risking their own borders. Diplomats who had smiled at Evan 3 days ago now avoided his eyes in the corridors. Evan received the news in his quarters from Vishan, who came personally. The Elari prince stood in the doorway, his crystal body dimmed to a low, troubled blue. "Your homeworld is surrounded," Vishan said. "The Velhari will not attack unless provoked, but the blockade will starve your outer colonies within 60 days. Toranes is betting that your government will surrender you in exchange for the fleet's withdrawal." Evan sat down slowly. "Will they? I do not know your people well enough to answer that." Evan thought about the colony on Mars where he grew up. The recycled air, the metal taste of water, the way his mother used to count ration packs at the end of each month. Those people did not deserve to starve because a machine had called him a name he did not ask for. "What are my options?" he asked. Vishan hesitated. "You could surrender yourself to Toranes. He would likely imprison you and the blockade would end. Humanity keeps its seat, though weakened." "And the Crownless King verdict?" "Erased as if it never happened." Evan stared at the floor for a long time. Then he stood up, and something in his face had changed. It was not anger exactly. It was not confidence. It was the expression of a man who had spent his whole life being told he was nobody and had finally decided that being nobody gave him nothing left to lose. "I want to speak to the full council," he said. "They will not listen. They will listen because I am not going to ask them for anything." The council chamber was less than half full when Evan walked in. Many houses had sent junior representatives or empty seats. Toranes was there in person, arms crossed, his yellow eyes tracking Evan like a predator watching something small. Surya was there, motionless, calculating. Vishan sat in his seat with his light burning steady. Evan stood in the center of the chamber. He had no prepared speech, no diplomatic notes, no advisors. He was a man in a borrowed jacket standing in front of the most powerful people in the galaxy, and he spoke the way he had always spoken, simply, directly, without decoration. "I know most of you think this is about me," he said. "A human who walked in front of your sacred machine and broke it. A nobody from a nothing species who somehow got a title that outranks everyone in this room. I understand why that makes you angry. I understand why that makes you afraid. I was afraid too on that dais. I am still afraid." He paused. The chamber was quiet. "But your crucible did not freeze because it was broken. It froze because for 4,000 years it has been handing out titles to people who were born into power and never once had to earn it. I know because it showed me. Every night since the ceremony, that machine has been whispering to me in my sleep, and what it showed me was not my future, it was yours. Your houses are crumbling. Your dynasties are hollow. Every generation inherits a little less understanding and a little more entitlement, and none of you will admit it because admitting it means admitting that your bloodline is not enough." Torani stood up. "You dare." "I dare because I have nothing," Evan said, and his voice did not rise but it cut through the room like a wire. "I have no fleet, no dynasty, no army, no crown. I'm a soldier from a colony built out of shipping containers on a planet that your species uses as a footnote in geography lessons. I have nothing to protect and nothing to lose, and that is exactly why the Crucible chose me. Because I am the only person in this building who will tell you the truth without worrying about what it costs." He looked around the chamber, meeting every pair of eyes that would hold his. "You can kill me, you can exile me, you can burn my homeworld and scatter my people, but you cannot stop what I represent. Because there are billions like me, on every world in this conquered, people born without titles, without bloodlines, without seats in this chamber, and they are watching. They watch me stand before the Crucible. They watch it call me king. And for the first time in 4,000 years, they are wondering why the machine never chose one of them." He let that sit in the silence. "The age of crowns is ending. You can fight it and be destroyed, or you can help build what comes next. That is the only choice that matters." Then he walked out. The chamber erupted. 3 minor houses stood and declared open support for the human, demanding the Velhari blockade be condemned. Within the hour, 9 more joined them. Surya watched the momentum shift with her compound eyes and made her calculation. She stood, smoothed her chitin with all 4 hands, and announced that the Kel supremacy would stand against the blockade. She did not do this out of principle. She did it because she had seen which direction the wind was blowing, and Surya always positioned herself downwind of power. Vishyan pledged his personal fleet to the defense of Earth's system. It was a smaller force than the Velhari armada, but the Elori ships were fast and well-armed, and their presence changed the mathematics. The coalition was not enough to match the Velhari in open battle, but it was enough to make Toranes think twice. It was not enough. Toranes ordered his fleet to advance. The 47 warships began moving toward Earth's inner system. The message was clear: talk was over. What happened next would later be called the Battle of the Sol Threshold, though it was less a battle than a desperate, ugly, brilliant act of defiance. Earth's 23 military ships formed a line at the edge of the inner system. Vishyan's Elori contingent took position on their flanks. The minor house coalition spread across the rear, a thin screen of donated vessels crewed by people who had never fought together before. Against them, the Velhari fleet advanced in perfect formation, outnumbering the defenders nearly 2 to 1. Evan was not in a command center. He was on a supply gunship, running ammunition and medical kits between ships. He had no authority to command the fleet and did not try. He did what he knew how to do, the unglamorous, necessary work that kept people alive while others made the big decisions. The first exchange of fire was brutal. The Velhari hit hard and the defensive line buckled. 2 human cruisers were disabled in the first minutes. An Elori frigate lost its engines and drifted. The math was simple and cruel. The defenders could not hold. Then the jump lanes behind the Velhari fleet lit up with incoming signatures. Not warships, cargo ships, mining vessels, colony transports, passenger liners, hundreds of them pouring out of faster-than-light travel in a ragged, uncoordinated flood. Earth's civilian merchant fleet, every ship that could move under its own power, had come. They were unarmed. They carried no weapons. What they did was simple and insane. They flew directly into the jump lanes and stopped, filling the corridors of space that the Velhari needed for retreat and reinforcement with a wall of civilian hulls. Families were on those ships. Children. People who had watched the ceremony broadcast, who had heard the Crucible speak, and who had decided that if the galaxy wanted to erase their representative, it would have to do it in front of every camera drone in the Concord. The Velhari fleet was surrounded, not by weapons but by witnesses. Toranes gave the order to fire on the civilian ships. His captains hesitated. His officers looked at each other. The camera drones were broadcasting live to trillions of viewers. One captain, then another, then a dozen more simply refused the order. They powered down their weapons and held position. The Velhari fleet withdrew, not in defeat, in disgrace. They pulled back through gaps in the civilian line, their weapons cold, their formation broken not by force but by the simple, terrifying stubbornness of people who had decided they would rather die than be invisible. Toranes was recalled to the Velhari homeworld, his political allies scattered. The blockade was over. Evan sat on the floor of the gunship as the news came through, surrounded by empty medical crates and spent supply containers. He did not celebrate. He put his head in his hands and breathed, because people had almost died, good people, brave people, civilians who should never have been in that position, and the weight of that sat on his chest like an anchor. Then his communication terminal chimed. A signal from Ithara Prime, strong and clear, cutting through every channel. The Crucible had reactivated. It was broadcasting one message on every frequency to every receiver in the galaxy. A single sentence, repeated like a pulse. Come back, it is time. The coronation spire had never held this many people. When Evan's shuttle landed on Ethara Prime, the Great Hall was already full beyond its designed capacity. The tiered seats were packed with noble delegations as before, but this time they were not alone. Crowding the aisles, standing along the walls, filling every corridor and overflow chamber with live feeds, were representatives of common populations from across the Concord. Workers, merchants, teachers, miners, soldiers without rank, farmers from colony worlds that had never sent anyone to the Spire in 4,000 years of its existence. They had demanded entry, and for the first time in history, no one had been able to refuse them. The camera drones numbered in the thousands. Every world in the Concord was watching. Evan walked through the crowd toward the dais. He was still wearing the same borrowed jacket. He had not slept in 2 days. There were dark circles under his eyes and a slowness in his steps that came from exhaustion rather than hesitation. People reached out to touch his arm as he passed, not in worship, not in ceremony, but in the way that ordinary people touch someone they recognize as one of their own. The crucible was alive. Its surface, cracked and dark since the ceremony, now glowed with a light brighter than anyone had ever seen. The hairline fractures that had appeared when it named Evan were still there, but light poured through them like veins of molten gold, making the obelisk look less like a machine and more like something that was being born. Evan stepped onto the dais. The hall fell silent, not the silence of ceremony, but the silence of a held breath. The crucible did not test him. It did not hum, did not scan, did not reach into his mind the way it had reached into the minds of 10,000 heirs before him. Instead, it did something it had never done in all its recorded history. It spoke to everyone. The voice that came from the obelisk was not the commanding thunder of the ceremony. It was older, quieter, and impossibly tired, like a voice that had been speaking for ages to listeners who never understood. It was broadcast simultaneously to every receiver, every screen, every communication device in the Concord. Every living being in the galaxy heard it at the same moment. I was built by a people who destroyed themselves. The words settled over the hall like dust. They were brilliant. They built cities in the hearts of stars and bridges between galaxies. They governed a civilization so vast that light itself could not cross it in a single lifetime. And they destroyed themselves because they believed that the right to lead could be inherited like property. Each generation passed its power to the next, and each generation understood that power a little less, until the people who ruled knew nothing about the people they ruled over. The collapse, when it came, was not sudden. It was slow and quiet and complete. The crucible's light pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. Before the end, they built me, not to crown kings, to prevent them. I was designed to test each generation's leaders and guide them slowly over centuries, away from inherited authority and toward earned service. Each title I gave was meant to carry a lesson. The luminous shield was meant to teach protection without possession. The iron mandate was meant to teach strength without cruelty. The storm general was meant to teach power without pride. But you did not learn. You took the titles as validation. You treated my words as stamps of approval rather than instructions for growth. Generation after generation, you took what I offered and made it into the very thing I was built to prevent. Evan stood still on the dais. He did not speak. He did not need to. I waited, the crucible continued. 4,000 years, I waited for a candidate who would show me that the lesson could still be learned. Not someone born to power, not someone trained for rulership. Someone who would stand before me with nothing, no bloodline, no dynasty, no claim, and show me the quality that my creators valued above all others. The light in the obelisk brightened. The willingness to lead without expecting to be followed. The willingness to serve without expecting to be rewarded. The willingness to give everything for people who would never know his name. I named him Crownless King because that is what all rulers should be, people who carry the weight of the crown without ever wearing it. Servants who lead, not masters who command. The voice softened. The crown was always meant to be set down. Then the crucible fell silent, and the light held steady, and the hall was so quiet that Evan could hear his own heartbeat. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the obelisk, then at the crowd, the princes and the workers, the generals and the farmers, the ancient houses and the people who had never been invited before today. They were all watching him, waiting. He understood what was being offered. The crucible had called him king. It could crown him now, make him the supreme sovereign of the entire Concord, the highest authority in the galaxy, backed by the weight of an artifact that every civilization had obeyed for 40 centuries. It was right there. All he had to do was accept. He thought about his mother on Mars, counting ration packs. He thought about the soldiers he had served with, men and women who did their jobs and went home and never asked for medals. He thought about the civilians in their cargo ships, floating in the dark between the Velhari guns and the cameras, betting their lives on the belief that being seen was worth more than being safe. None of those people needed a king. They needed a voice, and a voice was not something you wore on your head. No, he said. The word was quiet, but the microphones carried it to every corner of the galaxy. I am not going to be your king. That is the whole point. The crucible did not choose me because I am fit to rule. It chose me because I am the kind of person who knows he is not. And if the lesson of this machine is that crowns should be set down, then that is what I am going to do. He turned to face the full assembly. I propose a reformation. Not today, not overnight change that fast breaks things. A transition phased over a generation. The noble houses keep their cultures, their traditions, their identities. But seats in this council will be earned through service, not inherited through blood. Every world gets a voice. Every species gets a vote. The crucible stays as an advisor, a teacher, the way it was meant to be, not a machine that stamps approval on people who were born into the right family. He paused. I know this is frightening. I know it means giving up power. But the crucible showed me what happens to civilizations that hold on to power they did not earn, and it is not a future any of you want. The silence that followed was enormous. Then Vishan stood. The Elori prince's crystal body blazed with white light, brighter than anyone had ever seen it, and his voice carried across the hall with a clarity that rang like a bell. I accept. The crucible's purpose is clear, and I will not stand against it. I, Vishan of the Elori Dominion, relinquish the title of Luminous Shield and submit my house to the Reformation. He was the first hereditary prince in the history of the Concord to voluntarily give up his title. The Elori delegation behind him went very still, and then, one by one, they stood with him. Surya watched all of this with her 1,000-faceted eyes. She was quiet for exactly long enough to calculate every angle, every outcome, every advantage and disadvantage. Then she stood. The Kel supremacy accepts the Reformation, she said, on the condition that the transition framework includes provisions for meritocratic advancement in military and economic spheres. Evan nodded. That is exactly what meritocratic means. Surya's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Then, we are in agreement. One by one, the houses stood. Not all of them, some remained seated, their faces hard, their calculations different. But the majority rose, and the minor houses who had stood with Evan at the Battle of Saul rose loudest of all. Toranes was absent. He had been recalled to the Velhari homeworld in disgrace after the failed blockade. But months later, stripped of his title and his rank, he would be offered a position in the new Concord's military, a command earned through his actual skill as a tactician rather than his birth. He would accept it quietly, and those who served under him would say that he was a better officer than he had ever been a duke, because, for the first time in his life, the people who followed him did so because they chose to. The crucible dimmed. Slowly, gently, the golden light in its cracks faded. The obelisk that had judged 10,000 heirs across 4 millennia was going quiet, not dying, but resting, its purpose finally understood after ages of misuse. Before the last light went out, it spoke one final time. Not to the assembly, not to the cameras, not to the galaxy. Just to Evan, in a whisper that only he could hear. In 4,000 years, 10,000 heirs have stood where you stand. Every one of them asked what I could give them. You are the first to ask what you could give back. That is why you are the crownless king. That is why you will be the last. Then the light faded, and the crucible was silent, and Evan Mercer stood on the dais as the hall erupted into noise and motion, and the messy, complicated, beautiful chaos of a galaxy trying to figure out how to govern itself without kings. Years passed. The conquered Reformation was not smooth. It was messy and slow and full of arguments and setbacks and compromises that satisfied no one completely. But it held. The framework Evan had proposed was refined and adjusted and debated and rewritten dozens of times, and each time it emerged a little stronger, a little more representative, a little closer to what the Crucible's long-dead creators had hoped for. Evan served in the new conquered parliament as a representative of Earth's united territories. Not as president, not as chancellor, not as any kind of leader with a special title. Just one voice among many, one vote in a chamber that now included people from every world and every species, elected by the people they served. One afternoon, a young delegate from one of the outer colonies approached him in the hallway. She was Corvali, from Tessara, the disputed world from the Trial of Wisdom. She was young enough that she had grown up under the shared constitution Evan had proposed, and she asked him the question that everyone eventually asked. What did it feel like when the Crucible called you that name? Evan leaned against the wall and thought about it. He thought about the dais, and the silence, and the cracks in the ancient stone, and the weight of a word he had never asked for. It felt like being told the truth for the first time, he said. That nobody deserves a crown, but everyone deserves a leader who acts like they do not. The young delegate nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already believed. She walked away, and Evan watched her go, a girl from a world that had been tearing itself apart a generation ago, now serving in a parliament that her grandparents could never have imagined. That, he thought, was worth more than any title a machine could give. Across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds in 1,000 languages, they did not call him king. They called him what he had always been, the man who stood up when nobody asked him to, and who, when offered a crown, had the courage to set it down.